Fishers of men. Now we are familiar with two very famous fishers of men, Peter and Paul. Both men, extremely different, but both had the same goal, and they lived their goal toward the end, which was in martyrdom, because they followed the Lord and gave up everything for him. So who is Peter? Well, Peter was a fisherman. That's all he knew. He worked the seas at night. He went to the Sea of Galilee every night with his little boat, and he would go out and he'd fish, and he'd come back and do the same thing, because he had a little family he had to take care of. And one day, while he's fishing, he's coming back after a night that was pretty useless. He didn't catch many fish. And he saw this man walking down the shore. And the man called out to him and said, "Simon!" Now Peter's shocked because he doesn't even know how he knows his name. But he calls him, and Simon answers, and he says, "Did you have any luck last night catching any fish?" And Peter said, "No, just a couple here and there, mostly threw overboard, and we didn't have much." So he said, "Can I get into your boat?" And Peter says, "Get in my boat? What does this guy want?" So he gets into the boat. He knows that Jesus, just from his smell and from his hands, he's not a fisherman. So what's he want to do in my boat? But he says to Peter, "Get out to the shore. Go out to this little bit." And he said, "When we get out there, I'm going to tell you what to do." So Simon's really confused at this point, but he does what he says. And he goes out, and when he gets out a little distance, Jesus says to him, "Okay, now, take your nets and throw them overboard." Now Peter is really, really confused. But he does it. He throws his nets overboard, and lo and behold, what happens? We know the story. The nets were full. They were almost to the point of breaking. And he pulls them in, they go back to the shore, and Peter says, "Who is this man?" Now, we don't know whether Peter knew Jesus. We don't know whether he had heard about him, whether he had even met him before. But we do know at that moment, Peter was willing to give up everything and to follow him. But it wasn't an instantaneous conversion for Peter. It took a long time for Peter to get to where he was in his belief in Jesus. Oh yes, he followed him for 3 years. He went with him every place he went. He saw him heal. He saw him cure people. He saw him raise the dead. And his faith every single time had to grow a little bit more and a little bit more. Because Peter still, when he had heard about the Messiah, the Messiah to them wasn't somebody in a spiritual kingdom. Their Messiah was somebody who was going to save them from Roman occupation. So Peter had a lot to learn. And Peter wasn't always the easiest guy to get along with. Oh, he was impetuous. He had a horrible temper. He was a person who was doubting. He was a person who often flew off the handle. He even let Jesus have it one night when Jesus was trying to explain to him in a few weeks he was going to be crucified. And Peter wouldn't have any of that, so he yells at him. And that's when Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." But Peter goes on. And we know at the moment when Jesus needed Peter the most, Peter failed horribly. After Jesus had been taken, Peter denies him not once, not twice, but 3 times. He denies his best friend. He goes off crying, hiding himself because now he's really scared. If they're doing this to Jesus, what's going to do to me and my family? So he hides. Peter is not at the crucifixion. And the next time we see Peter, it's after the resurrection. And Jesus comes and meets with the apostles. But there's one particular incident where Peter stands out. And it's a replay of what happened when Peter was first called. Peter's out fishing. And after a night of fishing, he's bringing, a worthless evening. And as he's going to the shore, he sees on the shore a man cooking with a charcoal fire. And he thinks it might be Jesus. So he jumps out of the boat and he swims or wades to the shore. And he gets there because he's looking to see Jesus. And yet in his heart, he's scared. because he knows that he's betrayed his beloved. And he's afraid he's going to be taken to the woodshed. Because what's Jesus going to say to him? He's going to scold him, yell at him. Why were you unfaithful? But Jesus didn't do any of those things. Jesus never even mentioned his infidelity. All he simply did was say, Peter, do you love me? And Peter, sort of like out of sheepishness, says, yes, Jesus, you know I love you. And Jesus says to him, feed my lambs. And then a little bit later, Jesus again says to Peter, Peter, do you love me? Do you really love me? And Peter said, yeah, Lord, I told you I love you. And again, Jesus said, feed my lambs. And the third time, Jesus says to him a little later, Peter, do you really, really, really love me? Now, Peter's really frustrated at this point. Why would Jesus say 3 times? I've already told him twice. But this was a reminder of Jesus to him of his 3 times that he betrayed him. And then Jesus says to Peter, feed my sheep. And at that point, he was appointing Peter to be the fisherman of men. But Peter still didn't have the courage to go out and fish, for men anyway. It wasn't until after the Pentecost when his total transformation and conversion occurs. And that's when the Holy Spirit comes down upon Peter and blesses him. And at that point, he's able to go out and to meet the crowds of thousands and convert them on that one day. And after that, Peter's life was changed forever as a fisher of men. He spent the rest of his life going about preaching mainly to the Jewish groups of the life of Jesus. And he goes all the way up through Asia Minor, all the way up to Rome, until finally, when he gets to Rome, he eventually goes up to Rome, and there's where he ends his life in martyrdom, crucified for Jesus. But when the Romans came to Peter and said to him, we're going to crucify you, he said, no, you're not the way Jesus was crucified. I'm not worthy of being crucified the way my master was. So he says to them, if you're going to crucify me upside down. And so that's what he did. He was crucified upside down. Now there's another great fisher of man. Now this guy's entirely different from St. Peter. He was an educated person. He was a Pharisee. He had a lot of wealth, and he was prominent, and he was well known in the Jewish society. And he really didn't have any relationship with Jesus. He didn't walk with him, and he didn't know him physically, and he wasn't at the crucifixion or any of that stuff. His knowledge of Jesus was only what he had seen by what was going on in the communities at that time. And he was against this, because this was taking away from the Jewish community. But God had other designs for Paul. Paul, whose name was Saul at first, he was going out to persecute these new Christians. And as he was one day, he was driving his horse, or riding his horse, and God had a plan for him. He knocked him off his high horse, blinded him, and sent him to a man called Ananias. And when he gets to Ananias' house, he knocks on the door, and Ananias looks out and sees it's Saul, knows his reputation, doesn't want anything to do with this guy, because he's afraid too that this guy's going to come after him and do what he did to the other ones, kill him, or send him to the lions. But the message came to Ananias and said, no, open the door, let him in, he's your brother, and treat him as your brother. And Paul comes into his house. Ananias prays over him. The cataracts that were formed on Paul's eyes the time he was knocked off the horse are removed, and Paul stays there for about a year with them and adopts Jesus as his way of life. And Paul, from that moment on, began to evangelize the world. He evangelized the Gentiles, where Peter stayed with the Jewish community. And Paul became an evangelizer in the entire world. We have no greater evangelizer than Paul. Paul went up through all of Asia Minor and everywhere. He went up to Rome, and he was on his way to Spain when he was taken by the Roman government. And on the same day, as we said, Peter was crucified, Paul was beheaded. So, these two fishers of men were 2,000 years ago. But you know, Jesus needs fishermen today. And those fishermen have got to be us. We are to be the fishers of men today. And how do we do that? Well, we do that by, first of all, having a relationship with this God that loves us so much. We need to have a Christian life that's based on the morality and the values and the virtues that Jesus showed us how to live. And he showed us this very simply. Christian living comes down to two things. Love God and love your neighbor. And if you don't know how to do that, read the scripture when Jesus goes to the Mount and he gives the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the peacemakers. Read the Beatitudes, because that's the playbook for which Christianity is based. Love God, love your neighbor. It's our job right now, in order to change this world, which God only knows we need change. We need to have that missionary aspect of our life. We don't even have to leave our houses. We just have to become Christian. Because when we become Christian and we adopt the values of Jesus, then our life will change and we can become missionaries at home. How do we do that? One of the greatest missionaries never left her convent. That was St. Teresa of the Little Flower. She never left her convent. And yet, what is she? She is now the patron of missionaries because she kept all these people in her prayers. And we're all united in the fabric of time and space under the family of God. And what we need to do is to remember that there are a lot of fish out there that need to be saved. And it's up to us to do it. Because God has no hands but yours. He has no feet but yours. Because He is using you to become His fisher of men.